This ain't advice. I'm not your advisor. And as they say in the biz, slap that subscribe button. We're only about 100,000 away from a million. We're almost there. Welcome to another episode of WTF Is. This time, the S&P 500. You probably heard of the S&P 500, but you might not know what it is. Let's start with the name. S&P stands for Standard & Poor's. Standard & Poor's is a ratings company. They do ratings, and at some point, they decided we're going to make this thing called an index. So, what is an index? An index is basically anything in financial markets that tries to measure something. And in this case, there's a 500. The 500 in the S&P 500 is because there are 500 stocks. It's not quite, but pretty close to the biggest 500 stocks that are headquartered in the United States. Close enough for shooting. So what they're doing, and what they've been doing since 1957, is taking a look at the 500 biggest companies. Now, you can actually find data going back even further than that. They started as the S&P 90 back in 1926. They didn't become Standard & Poor's until 1941. But the S&P 500, as we know, it's been around since about 57. And it is a very broad, obviously, measure of how large U.S. companies are doing. It's the biggest 500. It runs the gamut from companies that are very, very large, the largest ones in the world, your Apples, Amazons, Microsofts, all the way down to companies that you might not even have heard of. Companies 498, 499, 500. I think they're actually like 506 because of A shares and B shares and stuff like that. But anyway, the point is, when people say, and there's a lot of advice that goes around that says, oh, you're saving money, you want to invest it, just invest in the S&P 500. And people seem to think that that's like a risk-free activity. And it couldn't be farther from the truth. Now, it does give you great diversification. But along a couple of dimensions, it doesn't give you much at all. So you don't have the problem where if you buy 100 shares of Tesla and Elon Musk goes crazy and he starts tweeting a bunch of things and the SEC says, Elon, you're out of here, it might really hurt the stock. When you have 500 stocks, the risk of any one individual or any one company having something really weird happen really going to throw you off, very, very small. However, the S&P 500 is all large cap stocks, number one. And number two, it's all US-based stocks. And it is true the largest US companies have a lot of revenues that come from the rest of the world. So there's a reasonable case to make that there is some international diversification inherent in owning the S&P 500. But not nearly as much as having an actual allocation to international markets. So in periods of time where international stocks outperform U.S. stocks, and this has been true for the last 10 years. But if you look back, it really goes in waves. I mean, it really, really does. If there's a period of time where international stocks outperform U.S. stocks and all you've got is the S&P 500, you're going to get outperformed. Whether that means you only go up 5% and other investors are getting 10% a year, or it means you're down 10% and other investors are only down 5% or something else. I don't know. But there's going to be some point where not having that international diversification is going to hurt. And then it doesn't include small or even really mid-cap stocks. So if there's a time when small cap stocks are doing the best, then the S&P 500 is going to lag that. This last 10 years, since 2008, has been a really interesting period because large cap U.S. stocks have basically killed every other asset class. as long as that's the way you slice them up, you say large cap US stocks, so the S&P 500, that's right here, and then everything else, bucket it up however you want. The S&P 500's done amazing. And for most people, especially for American investors, having the S&P 500 allocation be the core of your portfolio, a large cap US stock allocation be maybe 30, 40, 50, 60% of what you own in stocks, that makes perfect sense. And so then it's pretty easy to look around and say, why would I own anything else? That's sort of a dangerous thing to do, because we have to remember the S&P 500 is a lot, but it's not everything. And again, the S&P 500, you can invest in it, but that's because they made index funds that track it. The S&P 500, when that's what you say, you're referring to the index itself, which is just the measurement itself. It doesn't have any fees taken out of it. It's just measuring, okay, we got these 500 stocks and they did X, Y, Z today. What does that mean for this formula? And that's what an index is. An index has a formula so that everybody knows what the deal is. S&P 500, the most common thing that it gets compared or contrasted to is the Dow Jones, which is 30 stocks, 30 large, more industrial stocks. Dow Jones is a little older. Dow Jones has been quoted for longer. People know what Dow Jones points are. But S&P 500 is broader. It's 500 versus 30. It doesn't get changed around the same way the Dow Jones does. They have basically a committee deciding, hey, we're going to take this one out and put this one in the Dow. S&P 500 does have the same thing, but it's much more formulaic. So a lot of people that prefer the S&P 500, including myself, that's most of the reason why. It's broader, it's more formulaic, so you know what to expect, and it's just more diversified. It gives you a better look at the overall U.S. market. But they do end up and pretty close quarter to quarter, year to year, cycle to cycle. So I hope that helped answer the question of what the fuck is the S&P 500.